We'll get started this morning. I'm glad you're all here. And we can be thankful that the drought has ended. Yep. You know, it's interesting that we were just talking about how things are viewed through our modern eyes regarding sacrifice and shedding of blood, spilling of blood. These are things that are hard to comprehend a lot of times by our modern day standards with the SPCA and all this stuff, that animals would be sacrificed. But it happened. And Christ was sacrificed for us. So, last week, as we continued our study of Hebrews 11, the prominent heroes of faith we studied were Abraham and Sarah, with readings in Genesis 22. We talked about at least two examples of Abraham's faith lived out. And while looking at Abraham, we learned one of the names for God, Jehovah Jireh, which means God sees. And the connotation is that God sees the need and he sees to it. He supplies or provides, as many translations used there in Genesis. We discussed the word translated only begotten when God said to Abraham, you need to take your only begotten son, Yaqid in the Hebrew, and monogenes, in the New Testament. Basically same word, one Hebrew, one Greek. We read of Joseph and his bones, of his faith that his people were not going to forever live in Egypt. They would go to their own land. We read of Moses and the faith of his parents, and that they hid him in a basket on the Nile. It's interesting that we think about that as a fairly innocuous experience. Larry West posted a TikTok video about Louisiana and its waters. And this woman was saying, I want to show you about how you can tell if there are alligators. And she said gators. Gators in the water here in Louisiana. Now, I can't do her accent, but and she said to the videographer, come on. And she's on this, like a boat ramp type thing that slants down into the water. So she walks down right next to the water edge. And she said, now you can tell if there are gators in this water. She said, here's how you tell. She scoops down, sits and scoops up some water and goes like this. She said, if that water is wet, there are gators in there. She says, so you want to check, and if that water is wet in Louisiana, there are gators in there. Well, same thing with the Nile. I mean, if the water is wet, there are crocodiles in there. And here's this baby in the reeds at the edge of the river where the crocodiles would hunt. They had faith. And they also, it's interesting that they also bathed in that river where the crocodiles were. And I suppose maybe the servants formed an outer ring around the princes, so that if the crocodile was going to get somebody, why they would get somebody in the outer ring. I don't know. We read how that Moses, as he grew, turned his back on being a prince in Egypt, to suffer with God's people, the Israelites, foreshadowing Christ leaving heaven and suffering here on earth as a servant, as one who would do God's will, one who would be offered as a sacrifice. Turning his back on his heavenly position, as we read about in Philippians 2 some time ago. We didn't read about that last week, but we then read of the Passover parallel with the blood of the Lamb saving the firstborn of Israel and the stubbornness of Pharaoh causing the death of Egypt's firstborn. I think somebody raised the point, I think it was Donnie, about the fact that, wasn't Pharaoh the firstborn? And yes, he probably was, and why wasn't he killed? You know, the thought of some commentators, and this is just men's thoughts, are that the death of the firstborn referred to children under a certain age, because the lamb that was the sacrificial lamb could not be older than 1 year old. And so the lamb that was to save the firstborn of Israel couldn't be more than a certain age, probably just as they had said anybody under this certain age, well, as Herod did. Anyone under, what was it, 2 or 3, something like that, we're going to kill all those children. Well, that's the thought. Again, you won't find that in Scripture. We talked briefly of the significance of the designation of the firstborn to the Jewish people and how this 10th plague is so significant to our insight into who God is, because it was this marking of the residences where the firstborn lived with the lamb's blood, and that's what saved the Israelite firstborn males. And this is where we'll pick up with the Lord speaking to Moses. We're going to be over in Exodus chapter 4, because in this passage we learn the significance here of firstborn to God. God is designating his people as firstborn son. Exodus 4:21 through 23, please.
And the Lord said to Moses, "When you go back to Egypt, see that you perform before Pharaoh all the wonders that I have put in your power. But I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. Then you shall say to Pharaoh, This is what the Lord says. Israel is my son, my firstborn. So I said to you, Let my son go so that he may serve me. But you have refused to let him go. Behold, I am going to kill your son, your firstborn."
Okay, so this is how we know how God viewed Israel, because of what Moses recorded in the book of Exodus by God's own words, that he was to tell Pharaoh. This was at the burning bush when the burning bush, or shortly thereafter, where God is talking to Pharaoh. Go ahead. Oh, I thought you had something you were going to say. And so I want to tie this verse here, Israel is my firstborn son. I want to tie that in with some passages from Romans, a passage from John, and then we'll look at a verse. We'll jump ahead to Hebrews 12. Recall I prompted you, it's been at least last week, maybe the week before, to remember the phrase from Revelation where we read, "They will be my children," when he comes down and the city comes down in Revelation. This is significant because Paul, in multiple letters, speaks of adoption. He speaks of grafting in those who were not the Jews. In the Romans letter, he says that. He quotes Hosea 1 and 2, where it says, "They were not my people, and they have now become children of the living God." I think we've read that previously, but we're going to reread this passage from Doug. Are you ready to read? You want to go over to Romans chapter 9 for us, please? We're going to reread this passage from Romans, which is this quote from Hosea chapter 2 first, he quotes, and then chapter 1, a verse in Hosea. So Romans 9:25 through 26. And then Billy, if you would get over to John 1 after a bit, we'll read that. So Romans 9:25 and 26, please.
And it says in Hosea, I will call them my people who are not my people, and I will call her my loved one who is not my loved one. And in the very place where it was said to them, you are not my people, there they will be called children of the living God.
Okay, so the significance here is that the connection we're making is the children of the living God, the God's children, the firstborn. These are my firstborn. You didn't let my son go. Your firstborn is going to die. And they're called children of the living God. In John 1, verses 10 through 13.
10 through 13.
This is John describing Christ, of course.
And the whole multitude of the people were praying outside at that hour of the
Are you in John 1 or 1 John 1?
John 1.
John 1:10.
Yes. Oh, sorry, I'm in Luke. No wonder something didn't seem right. Sorry. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, and yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not accept him. But as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, to those who believe in his name, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God.
They were born of God, right. They got this right to become the children of God. So if God's people are called firstborn in the Old Testament, then a verse coming up in Hebrews 12 makes more sense. We're going to jump ahead to that and put it in here as another piece of this firstborn reference. This word prototokos, firstborn. This word, like the phrase only begotten son, is used in the New Testament most often to refer to Christ as the one born first, the firstborn, or the one who is the most important because of his position. Mark, you want to read Colossians for us, chapter 1, verse 15, and then verse 18, please, and then Jody will be in Romans 8. Colossians 1, 15 and 18. Gary, do you want to read? Yeah, do you want to read at some point? Okay, I'll have you read, looking ahead here, Hebrews, will be in Hebrews 12 when I have you read, okay? All right, so over in Colossians, the firstborn, the one who has preeminence, Colossians 1:15 and 18.
And 18.
Yes, please.
He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. And he is the head of the body of the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent.
Okay, now in verse 15 that Mark read, was that ESV?
ESV.
Okay, it said firstborn. Look how the New Century renders this. Exactly like God, he ranks higher than everything that has been made. I think Mark said the firstborn of all creation. And it goes along then with he has the first place, as verse 18 says. The firstborn. Go ahead.
Without anything, without him, anything that was made would not have been made.
Correct.
So,
And everything exists because of him,
right.
John says.
So John 1 ties in dramatically
Yes.
with this.
Okay. Romans 8, 28 and 29. Please.
And we know that God causes all things to work together for good, to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to become conformed to the image of his Son, so that he would be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters.
Okay, and so again, the first child among many brothers and sisters. And again, we get this God's choosing. God chose Israel. They are my firstborn. You didn't let my firstborn son go. It's going to cost you your firstborn. We are the firstborn of God in the same way that Israel was, and Christ was born first, so he has the prominent position in creation. He has the prominent position in the resurrection. He has the prominent position among his siblings, but God chose us to be like him, and that's why we're told, clothe yourself with Christ. We put on Christ. We clothe ourselves. So when we stand before God, and you've heard me use this analogy before, we stand before God, God looks at us and says, oh yeah, that looks just like my kid. Sure, come on in.
Well, you've got something that's seen as pure, but it's that sin has been covered up.
Yes.
It's not there anymore.
So these references here, John, Colossians, Romans, are all references containing the word that's translated firstborn. However, in becoming children of God, we have become part of his family. And just as in the New Testament, God's people were called his firstborn. In the Old Testament, they were called the firstborn, so it is in the New Testament. And the Hebrews writer, we've looked at this over and over, the Hebrews writer over and over and over reminds his readers of the superiority of the new agreement and everything that has to do with the new agreement over the old agreement. Of how the tabernacle and its sacrifices were inferior to the real tabernacle in the heavens. In chapter 12, he reminds them of this terror that Israel experienced when they came before this smoking mountain and the lightning and everything of Sinai or Sinai. The terror that filled God's people at Mount Sinai when God's presence came near, and contrasts that. He said, you didn't come to this. We'll study that when we get to it here, but you didn't come to that. He instead shows how that Christ has taken us through the curtain into that most holy place, into God's presence. So our experience is completely different from the wilderness Israelites' experience, because our experience of coming near God, coming to God's dwelling place, is as a child of God and is without fear. And so we don't approach God as they did, shaking, quaking, quivering, maybe hiding in the tents, fearful of being struck dead. Hebrews 12:22.
But ye have come to Mount Zion, and the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to myriads of angels. How far do you want me to go?
Down to 24.
Okay. To the general assembly of the church of the firstborn,
Okay, there it is. Go ahead.
who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the Spirit of all righteousness made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood, with which speaks better than the blood of Abel.
Okay, and the New Century says has a better message than the blood of it. What is this better message? What is that reference to? What was Abel sacrificing for? What were sacrifices for?
Pleasing of God.
To please God, and subsequently to separate them from their sin. The sacrifice was to make payment, as it were, for the sin. And it speaks of Abel's faith here on earth, but again, that's a shadow. Jesus' sacrifice was superior for reasons that we've discussed and when we went through that whole study of Jesus' superior sacrifice. But it was superior because while Abel's sacrifice speaks to us regarding his faith, as a demonstration of his faith, Jesus' sacrifice speaks to us from heaven. Abel spoke from earth. Jesus' sacrifice speaks from heaven because that's where he has gone. And so it speaks from God's throne. So again, you see the superiority, and that's the reason it says this has a better message. This sprinkled blood that we have come to, Jesus' blood, that was sprinkled the same way Moses' blood was the blood of the Passover was sprinkled on the doorpost. Jesus' blood has a much superior message than that sacrifice that Abel made. That make sense? Okay. So, while the Old Testament sacrifices under both the patriarchal era, where Abel was, and then under the Mosaical era, which Moses started under God as a messenger of God, separated the one offering the sacrifice from his or her sin. I think the Passover lamb. Jesus' blood, his sacrifice, actually blotted out sin, washed away sin. I mean, in the Old Testament, he's referred to as a fuller soap, I think, and whiter than wool, and so on and so on. I mean, so just as Moses used the blood of the lamb in Hebrews 11 to mark God's people and save the firstborn, Jesus brought the new agreement from God, and by sprinkling his blood, saved God's firstborn. Okay? And now we'll be continuing in chapter 11, Gary, if you are ready to read. And we'll start in because we left off there in verse 28, where it was Moses sprinkling the blood on the doorposts. And then we'll start here in verse 29 and go down through well, we'll stop after 34 briefly. So 29 through 34, please, Gary. Yes, please.
At 29,
Yep.
By faith, the people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land, but when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell after the people had marched around them for 7 days. By faith, the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about King Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies.
Okay. So, can you imagine the surprise? You're marching along, you're in the Egyptian army, and you just saw the Israelites go through there. It was dry. Well, I don't know, I've never seen anything like this, but I mean, there's dry land, and you get out in the middle, and all of a sudden it all collapses. And they weren't known in that time, as far as I'm aware, for being good swimmers, because you don't swim with crocodiles.
You don't swim good with armor on either.
No. So, the surprise. And I wonder if there was any discussion when Joshua said, okay, folks, we're going to march around this city every day for the next week.
For people involved.
Yeah. And then on the seventh day, I don't know what day they started, but I'm assuming the seventh day may have been a Sabbath. I don't know. Yeah, I should have reread the account. It may tell us. Anyway, okay, we get up this morning. Everybody ready? Hey, we're going to do it 7 times today. And then get ready to rush in. Yeah, right.
Anything better to do.
It's Saturday. No. And just as, if you read Hosea talks about Israel and God's rejection of Israel. And in Hosea 1, this is where he gives instructions to Hosea the prophet to go marry a woman who's a prostitute and all that. And they have children. And he says that he's naming his children different things because God tells him to name them this way. In Hosea 1:8, the Lord says this third child, a second son, daughter, son. The third child, name him Lo-Ammi, because you are not my people and I'm not your God. That word means not my people. And he says then in verse 10, the number of Israelites will become like the grains of sand of the sea. So the prophet here is switching to the modern day Israel, not geographic Israel, the Israel that we talked about, the Israel of God, the family of God. But what I wanted to read here was in verse 7, because it's the same way here as what they witnessed when they went through the Red Sea. They didn't have to fight that army. God says, I will not pity Israel anymore, nor will I forgive them, but I will show pity to the people of Judah. I'm reading Hosea 1:7. Will show pity to the people of Judah. I will save them, not by using bows or swords, horses or horsemen, or weapons of war. We would say no tanks, no grenades, no RPGs, no missiles, no jets or bombs. I, the Lord their God, will save them. I'm going to do it. They're not going to do it. It won't be because of their own power. It won't be because of their own efforts. I'm going to do it. And that's exactly what we saw at the Red Sea.
This just echoes, we want a king. No. I am your king. No, we want a king.
Yeah. We want. I mean, everybody else is around here. Look at. I mean, yeah. Yeah. All right. The other thing before we move on, notice in verse 34, they were saved from being killed with swords. Say, okay, fine. Because when we get down a little further here, that's going to be significant. Gary, go ahead in 35 there, if you would, please. And read down through 37.
Women were received back their dead and raised to life again. Others were tortured and refused to be released so that they might gain a better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging, while still others were chained and put in prison. They were stoned, they were sawed in two, they were put to death by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated.
Okay. The reason that I point out this, they were saved from being killed with swords, and now they were killed with swords, in verse 37, is because we can demonstrate our faith, we can demonstrate great faith by how we are blessed by escaping death or disease or healed from disease. And we can also demonstrate great faith through our death, through disease, through ordeals, and how that is accepted. It's interesting, over the years in medicine, I saw a number of people who were sick. Duh, right? Some of them would never get better. And the way that they approached life said so much about who they were. Because even though we had multiple discussions maybe of there's not anything else that can be done here, some people were like, well, they're running, scurrying around, I need to go see somebody else, then I need to get another opinion, I need to do this, I need to do that. Even though I knew that would do no good, because maybe they had already seen multiple specialists and subspecialists, and maybe even subspecialists. But I'm not going to accept this answer. And, there's something to be said for that. But there's also accepting what is there with grace and with faith. Jehovah Jireh.
But in that situation, some of them probably saw quacks too.
Yes.
And that's an unfortunate thing whenever you're grasping at straw.
Right. Yep. Pancreatic cancer. Think Steve Jobs. I had a cousin that was probably 8 years older than me, maybe 10. And he died from pancreatic cancer. And it's interesting because basically at that time, now there are some things on the horizon that may change that, but I mean, that's a death sentence. And I don't know about Steve Jobs because I don't know a lot about his medical history, but a lot of times you saw people doing all kinds of things. They'd try, as Mark was saying, they would try, various things, not literally, but, inject bleach into your vein and get rid of it and that kind of thing. I know of one individual that went to Mexico and to try some herbal things down there. And, I don't have anything against herbal things. Most of our drugs are from some sort of herb at some point. Anyway, we can glorify God through our faith in life and how we live it and how we accept things and how we deal with things, whether we're kicking and screaming or whether we're saying Jehovah Jireh. And we can in death. Paul says, I fought a good fight. I finished the course. I'm ready to go. I know what's ahead. Okay?
There was a woman down here in the hills that had that kind of an attitude. And it was very pleasant and faith-building to see. She always laughed about just about everything.
Yeah. I'm married to one.
It's interesting is we get caught up into why, what, how. Why do our bodies fail? Our bodies fail because way back in the beginning, sin entered into the world. And God has provided a solution to that death problem, but the symptoms are still there until the end of time. But why does God hate sin? What does it do?
Destroys.
Destroys.
Yeah.
But that is the answer. That's why things are the way they are at times. It's because sin was introduced at the beginning.
Okay. I think we'll stop there. They were weak and yet were made strong. They were powerful and defeated other armies. Any other comments before we quit? Okay. Thank you for your comments, your reading.
We got 1 or 2 weeks left. At least 2.
I think 3 or 4.